Should male sex offenders ever be allowed to call themselves a woman and end up in a women's prison? It's the focus of a huge row in Scotland, with the Scottish and UK government also at loggerheads over a new law that would make it easier to change gender. To discuss that and more, we're in Glasgow, Scotland's biggest city and a place that was deep Labour red for almost a century before the SNP became the dominant party. We'll also be talking about teacher strikes across the UK. And has anyone got the answers to fixing the economy? Welcome to Question Time. The SNP's Jenny Gilruth is Transport Minister in the Scottish Government. She was a teacher for 10 years, having graduated from this very campus, Strathclyde University, before being elected to Holyrood in 2016. And in the true spirit of cross-party relations, she's married to the former Scottish Labour leader, Kezia Dugdale. From the UK Government is the Scotland Office Minister John Lamont, a solicitor by profession. He's now an MP in the Borders. He's in the department that runs Scottish affairs, reserved to Westminster. Ian Murray shadows that very department for Labour and is the party's only MP in Scotland. Before entering politics 20 years ago, he ran a pizza delivery service and worked in pensions. He's also a keen supporter of his beloved Heart of Midlothian FC. The commentator and broadcaster India Willoughby is the self-styled world's first trans newsreader, joining Channel 5 in 2017, having been a TV reporter before that. She's since appeared in various programmes such as Loose Women, Good Morning Britain, Celebrity Big Brother, and is a supporter of Scottish independence. And Ella Whelan is a freelance journalist, commentator and author. She's committed to free speech and is a regular contributor to the nonconformist Spite Online. Her book is titled What Women Want: Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. From Strathclyde University, welcome to our panel, welcome to our audience here, welcome to you at home. Our audience, of course, as always, reflects the political views of the nation that we are in. Very good to see you here this evening. And you at home can, of course, join in the debate as well on social media. There's always a lively conversation goes on there, so feel free to add your view there. Let's take our first question tonight, which is from Alison Beattie.
Yesterday, teachers in England and Wales joined teachers in Scotland who are already taking strike action. Are Scottish teachers worth a 10% pay rise?
Alison, are you asking this as a teacher?
Yes, I'm a primary school teacher in Glasgow. I've been out on strike with my colleagues 3 times since November. This is a subject I obviously feel very passionately about. My answer to this question is yes. Not just for teachers, but all public sector workers deserve a pay rise in line with inflation.
So Alison's question refers to teachers in England, Wales and Scotland. Obviously there's teacher strikes going on in England as well. So John, let's start with you. Are teachers worth a 10% pay rise? They're asking for a little bit more down in England, 10.5, I think.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Alison. It's a very important question. My mother's was a teacher, so I'm very, very familiar with the teaching profession. And I think we should pay tribute to the hard-working teachers and other public sector workers, not just here in Scotland, but across the UK, who have done a sterling job, particularly during the COVID pandemic. Now, I regret... But
what Alison's saying is not tribute she wants so much, she wants money.
Well, I regret the decision of the unions to go out and strike. The UK government's working very hard. They want an open and honest dialogue with the teaching profession and the other public sector workers who are striking. I worry about the impact, particularly in relation to the teachers' strike, the impact it will have on our young people who have clearly lost a large part of their education during the pandemic.
So how do you resolve it?
Well, the UK government's view is we have the independent peer review bodies which have put forward a recommendation for how much the pay increase should be. The UK government, just like the Scottish government, have a very important balancing act to do in terms of delivering that pay rise whilst recognising we are responsible for taxpayers' money. And if the pay rises are excessive, it simply feeds the problem of inflation, which the UK government has as one of its top priorities. The cost of living difficulties which many households are facing just now is because of the rising rate of inflation. Thankfully, we hopefully have seen the peak of that inflation rate fall back, but by giving excessive pay rises would simply feed that inflationary pressure.
OK, Alison, I know you want to come straight back in. Let me get around and no, I will come back to you, I promise. Jenny? It's the same problem here in Scotland, and of course you're a former teacher, so
I am.
do you want to give your colleague, your former colleague there, a pay rise?
Well, I very much recognise the challenge here. As you know, I'm a former teacher. My little sister is a teacher, and many of my friends are still in teaching, and they work.
Is she very cross with you that you're not giving her
No, she's not very cross with me.
She's asking for.
But teachers are extremely hard-working, and I think we all recognise that if you have family members who work in education, it's an extremely rewarding and extremely challenging at times role. And we want to make fair and affordable pay offers to our public sector workers in Scotland. Absolutely. I mean, as Transport Minister, I worked really closely with the rail unions on the recent rail disputes. Earlier last year, we managed to get to a resolution, for example, with train drivers and the ASLEF trade union. That's why we didn't have rail strikes in Scotland yesterday. We won't have them tomorrow because we got a resolution to that strike.
But Alison's question is, are Scottish teachers worth a 10% pay rise? And your answer is presumably no, because that's not what you're offering.
Well, look, of course, in Scotland, we're a devolved parliament. We don't have full borrowing powers of an independent country. And if we
if you did, would you give them 10%? Is that what you're saying?
If we want to make increases to our pay offer, then we have to look at other parts of our budget. That's the.
So you're saying if you were independent, you'd offer them 10%? Is that actually what you're saying?
Well, I think it's a reasonable request. When inflation is running at 10% because of Tory inaction and recklessness over the economy, that is why public sector workers are rightly asking for higher increases, because things are costing more money because of Tory inaction and financial recklessness last year, which is really hurting particularly teachers, but all public sectors workers really hard.
Alison, do you want to come back in?
I would have to challenge that discussions have been productive. Certainly in Scotland, it's not been. In November, we rejected 5%. We asked for 10%, and there's been nothing more. We're months down the line. We have to take... No teacher I know wants to take strike action. No one will compromise with us. We've not taken this lightly. I think if anyone knows the effect it's had on children, it's teachers, and we understand the impact it's had on children. But what else can we do now when no one will negotiate with us beyond our hard line? And I do appreciate the money has to come from somewhere. We have no interest in taking money away from anyone else. I'm speaking as a teacher, but as also a public sector worker. We want all public sector workers to be paid fairly. And that is going to have to be in line with inflation. Workers in this country should not have to pay the price for mistakes that have been made by our government.
Okay. Thank you.
I think Alison absolutely does deserve 10% pay rise. If you look at the statistics, teachers are already, before we have the 10% inflation rate at the moment, over the last decade, you're running 10% behind already. So you're done there. But I think it's really important to point out, and I hope that you would echo me on this, it's not just about the money. It's about the conditions and the extra tasks that teachers are now expected to carry on, out-of-school activities, feeding children that don't have any food because of what the government's been doing over the last decade. And I think it's a bit rich of a government that some individuals, they don't pay their tax. Others are handing out contracts to their chumocracy, multi-million pounds. We're hearing about workers in Amazon warehouses, 50 years old, who are wearing electronic tags and being told they're not peeing quick enough. What sort of world is that? So 10%, the best investment you can make is children. You absolutely deserve it.
The man with the chit-chat.
I would just like to say thank you, India, for saying that. Our wages in teaching, I'm a teacher myself, our wages are down 20%, and that is ridiculous. I think what we have to remember here is that our working conditions are your children's learning conditions, and if you want to attract the best teachers to our profession, then you have to give us what we deserve, and we deserve a fair pay rise.
Okay, woman here in front of you.
Would it not be an idea for the whole of the public sector to get a pay rise all at the same time? And if government can give themselves a pay rise, and they're the public sector, why can't the rest of the public sector get it too? And it would be fair across the board then.
And do you wonder where the money might come from?
If the government can give themselves a pay rise, then they can find a way to give everybody with their departments a pay rise.
But do you mean the Scottish Government or the Westminster Government?
All of them. I don't understand why the government thinks that one part of the public sector works harder than the other, so it can get a pay rise and the other can't.
Good point.
Okay.
Well, can I just say thank you to Alison? I'm sitting here today because of the great teachers that I had. I went to Wester Hailes Education Centre, a great community centre, community education centre in Edinburgh, and without that inspiration of those teachers and the great learning that I got and my colleagues got, I'm not sure we would have had any social mobility whatsoever, so thank you. But look, politics is all about choices, isn't it? And we released some figures last week that shows that your wages, Alison, and the other teacher here, is on average across Scotland £800 lower in real terms since 2010. So the chickens are now coming home to roost because you were asked as public sector workers to help the government out of the hole they were in with austerity, and now you're being asked again to pay the price for inflation being out of control, made in Downing Street. So we've had 12 years of wage stagnation. We now have an inflation crisis, which means that we have an interest rate crisis, which means your mortgages are going up as well. We have a cost of living crisis. We have an energy crisis, and all of that is because of government decisions. So you now come, rightly, and say, after everything we did during the pandemic, and the education being the biggest contribution we can make to the economy, we're asking for a fair pay rise. And you're right, it has to be fair.
Well, I've asked the other two politicians on the panel, would you pay 10%? Would Labour pay 10%?
I think the 5% is too low because people are still out on strike. The 10.5% is negotiating. I would just say to the government, nothing has been done. There's been no new offer since August last year. Get round the table, thrash it out, negotiate the pay, negotiate the conditions, and get an agreement. That's the only thing governments can do, and they need to get down and do it.
OK, Ella.
So no, no and no is essentially your answer from every politician. And, you know, there's no point spending a long time thanking workers and, you know, plormoshing them. I think what the strikes in it's an Irish word. It means it's a nice way of saying brown-nosing them, actually.
All right, okay.
But I think the strikes in all areas of the public sector, and whether it's the trains, whether it's the nurses, whether it's teachers, the amount of strikes that are coming out, and I support them wholeheartedly, reveal very clearly that politics at the moment is very clearly divided. I think the pandemic accelerated this between us and them, and a very stark class divide in politics at the moment. Whereas this lady at the front said, it's absolutely possible for politicians to whip out a few quid for themselves and to find money for their pet projects and to spend loads of money in places where it's not necessary. And when workers come cap in hand, and really it's degrading to try and emotionally blackmail teachers or nurses by saying, what about the children or what about the patients? And say that, and say there's simply not enough for you. We get this narrative in this country that we're all in it together, that we all have to tighten up the belts, that we all have to do our bit. That's an absolute nonsense, and it's not the responsibility of a worker in whatever industry, in whatever job, to pay the price of the mistakes that government has made, or indeed to pay the price of situations like the war in Ukraine, or indeed the pandemic. What your responsibility is, and any individual worker, is to fight for your pay and to fight for your working conditions. And all you have to remember is it could be you tomorrow. So I suggest you support the strikes. Come on here.
It was an interesting use of language for John Boy there. He said that the
John
unions...
Boy, did you just say?
John Boy, John. He mentioned that the unions have decided to go on strike. Actually, it's the teachers that are the members of those unions who have decided to go out on strike. So important to note that, because your government's really good right now at bashing unions when all they're trying to do is support their members. But that aside, my partner's a teacher. And one of the things that I would be quite keen to note as well is that over the past number of years, Jenny, council budgets in Scotland have been slashed, and we have loads of teachers who are qualifying, right, but can't get a job. So there's two sides to this. There's the council budgets that have been slashed, and the fact that John's government don't want to give public sector increased pay.
Now, I know I'm listening to the applause that's coming from all of you, and I know the majority of people, according to polling, support the teachers' strike. I know, obviously, there are people as well that don't support it and don't feel that 10% is reasonable. Just in the interest of balance, is there anyone here in the audience who wants to express that view? Yes, the man there in the glass, and the man here in the yellow shirt afterwards. Yes.
I used to be a primary school teacher, and I left because I wasn't earning the income that I wanted to support my family. And I started up a business. And that business employs about 20-odd people now, 25 I think we're at. And it's a very fine line between balancing the books. I would love nothing more than to be able to go in and say, here's a whole load, and we have done it. We've given everybody an allowance over the winter just to try and help people out. But we can't just fix it at 10%. If I sell something for £100, I have to buy stock at £30. I have to pay wages, which are 35%. I have to keep some back of that profit because I have to invest next year, because if I don't keep investing, there's nothing left. I think it's sometimes quite idealistic and simplistic to just say, I want the money, get me the money, and not think about the wider ramifications. And I think sometimes, and I do empathise with the people in the public sector, but all I'm hearing is public sector, public sector, public sector. The private sector is not getting pay rises like this.
And just a last point here for the man in the yellow.
I'm also an employer, and I have a lot of empathy with my staff. I'm very close to them. We're a close-knit company. I would love to be able to go to each and every one of them and say, there's a 10% raise. I cannot do that, but I'm also pragmatic about it. I know the world that we're living in. I know that the Bank of England is trying to get the interest rates back down again to a manageable level. Then that leaves an unfair advantage to the private sector. So let's be honest about it. Let's not play politics about it. Let's think about it. Let's get the truth about it. And it starts with you guys being honest about it.
Okay. We've got a number of questions to get through. I'm going to move on, if I may. But before I do, I just want to say that Question Time is in Swindon next week in the southwest of England, and the week after that we are in Rugby in Warwickshire. So if you'd like to come to either show and you'd like to be part of the audience, go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions that are on the screen, and you can come and be part of our audience. And also we have all the dates there up until Easter. So if any of the shows are coming near you, do come along and be part of the conversation. OK, let's take another question now from Kelly. Kelly Ricks. Ah, there you are.
Those opposed to gender reforms wonder why safeguarding has been tightened for women's prisons but not for women's only spaces in society. Should there be an urgent wider review in light of the double rapist Ella Bryson?
Right, so let's just put a little bit of context here. So Scotland has passed a law which Westminster has vetoed, which would make it easier and quicker to change gender. And at the same time, because that law is not in effect here in Scotland, at the same time, a convicted male rapist, the Ella Bryson you're referring to, is claiming to be a woman and wants to be in a woman's prison. And that decision is now under review. What's your view, Kelly, since you asked the question?
I'm quite a liberal person, so my concern would be that somebody's taken advantage of a situation as a means and a way of getting round to vulnerable people. So that's the worry, really. Now, where's the protection for those women?
OK. Jenny?
So, obviously, we've just recently passed the legislation that the lady has spoken to, and the legislation hasn't passed into law because the UK government has taken a very unusual step in enacting
an unprecedented step.
Indeed. In enacting a Section 35, which has never happened in the history of devolution. It's very unusual for the UK government to behave in this manner, and we'll come to that momentarily. I think to the issues at play here, the individual case has obviously been discussed at First Minister's Questions here in Scotland, I think now on 2 occasions. And let's be very clear, that individual is a rapist. That individual has committed a heinous crime against a woman, and that individual deserves to be in jail for a very, very long time. Now, we also, at the same time, in Scotland and across the UK, need to be mindful that trans women are not all a threat to other women. Predatory men are a threat to other women. We know that. So we need to be really mindful and careful about our language, and I think that's hugely important. The Equality Act, of course, allows for there to be a delineation between single-sex spaces, so that is you're able to do that essentially under the provisions within the Equality Act, and I think that's quite important to say that. But it's been, I think, quite, at times, a toxic debate in Scotland, but it's worth saying that this legislation passed in the Scottish Parliament with an overwhelming majority of parliamentary support. We had Labour MSPs, Conservative MSPs, Liberal MSPs, Green MSPs and SNP MSPs from every party supported it. So for the UK government to take this unprecedented action to block the democratic will of the Scottish Parliament is unprecedented, as Fiona has said, but it also calls into question, really, devolution and the role of the UK government in that. And, you know, I think there are bigger challenges down the road in that respect for Scotland.
Also, it's worth mentioning that there were, 9 SNP MSPs, I think, who didn't support it.
There were.
You say it was across the board. So, India, Kelly's question is, those opposed to gender reform wonder why safeguarding has been tightened for women's prisons, but not for women's only spaces in society. So should there be a wider review of that, given what's happening with Ella Bryson?
No. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for inviting me, because this has been a debate now that has raged for minimum 3-4 years. It's been incredibly toxic and it's been awful as a trans person.
Do you mean in terms of the gender reform?
I mean the whole debate, and to be sat at home and see people who aren't actually trans discuss your life and paint you as a whole en masse as dangerous to society and unwanted is just horrible. But to the point in question, there are bad apples in all walks of life. There are bad Protestants, there are bad Catholics, there are bad lesbians, there are bad gays, and yes, there are bad trans people. And all of those people, if they do something criminal and are found guilty, they deserve to go to jail and to be punished. A jail that is suitable for them and where everybody else is safe. And what you've been subjected to, I'm afraid, over the last couple of weeks, which is now par for the course, is a lot of misinformation by a media that is completely transphobic. We have an audited trail of 1,000 plus negative stories a month on 0.5% of the population. It's not even 0.5, because if you half that, it's only trans women that people are getting upset about. So that's 1,000 articles a month on 0.2% people. Just to let you know, the thing about these prisoners being put in with women isn't actually true. They were put in solitary confinement during that time. They were held on a wing that was available at that point. I've been to prisons, I know how the system works. Since 2004 in Scotland, the rule has been that anyone who's trans and wants a transfer into the women's estate can apply. That's a human right. They're entitled to apply. And the procedure is then that a panel of mixed professionals from different disciplines will compile reports, they'll get together and discuss it. And there is categorically no way somebody who has committed rape would be moved into the women's estate. Now, I know some of you might not believe that, given what you've read in the press, but a lot of these stories are made up.
Can I just ask you, I hope it is a given here that no one is suggesting that because you are trans,
well, I'm sorry,
that clearly you would be offended, because that's clearly not what we're going to be saying here.
This is a bigger issue for you.
No, but I just wanted to, I'm so sorry, India, but I just wanted to, when you say that no one who is a sex offender or a rapist and claim to be a woman could pass a panel, be put in a women's prison. Tiffany Scott, who's a trans woman with a history of extreme violence, has got a lifelong restriction order after being convicted of stalking a 13-year-old. She was approved to go to a female prison in Scotland. And this by the Scottish Prison Service, and this is now, because this whole hoo-ha is under review. I'm not saying it's an issue of a trans issue, but nonetheless, the Scottish Prison Service doesn't seem to be catching these people when they should.
Well, with respect, it is. I think there's 4 trans women in the Scottish prison.
I was just giving her as an example where she was
at the moment. None of whom have committed offences. And with the greatest respect, it is a bigger picture, and you can see that by the context of the question and how it's blended into something else. You know, we're talking about some bad apples here who've done horrible things and nobody is defending them. But it's now the attempts are being made to try to broaden it out so it will affect somebody like me. So if I was on a night out and I got raped, where would I be sent? Would I be sent to a male prison? That's where some people would like to send me, which would be ridiculous. Trans women are 20 more times likely to be attacked. And I think there's this idea as well that women's prisons are like the Women's Institute. Everybody's making jam and doing knitting. They're really bad places. This particular jail used to be known as Scotland's toughest prison. And I think at the end of the day, it's the best prison for the best person.
OK. Ella?
Well, Jenny says that language is very important, and I agree. And I think most people at home will have noticed that you kept saying the individual. But, I mean, you have to start beg the question, is Adam Graham the double rapist? A man
Who now calls himself Ella Whelan.
Fine, if that's what he wants to do. A man or a woman? Because the question at hand is not whether this rapist should serve a sentence for rape. It's whether this individual is a man or a woman, and therefore which prison he or she goes into. So what is your answer? Is this individual a man or a woman?
I'm sorry, this individual is a rapist.
No. We know that. I want to know, is this individual
Ella,
a man or a woman?
Please? The First Minister was asked this question today at First Minister's Question Time. She gave the response
Very confusing answer.
If you'll let me speak. She gave the response that she didn't know enough about the individual in question. I would say likewise. But I think the most important thing in this case, we have to be very careful because we trust the Scottish Prison Service to make these judgments on behalf of Scottish ministers. That is their role, that is their job. And it's also worth saying to the point in relation to reviews, there are 2 reviews underway at the moment in Scotland, one in relation to the case that was previously discussed,
you haven't answered the
and that
question.
will report tomorrow, and the second is being undertaken by the Scottish Prison Service and will report directly to Scottish ministers. It is absolutely essential. We trust the Prison Service to make these decisions.
You haven't answered the question.
Our prison population safe. I have answered the question.
No, you haven't. You haven't. But can I just say, Fiona, if I can cut... the reason why I think
this is... Jenny one more chance to answer the question?
Carry on, yeah.
Because the audience
I'd love to hear your answer.
Well.
I really would.
This individual is a rapist. That is the most important thing.
Now, listen, the reason why this is such an important question is because, you know, as Kelly said, this is a discussion that is not just about the situation of prisons or rape crisis centres, which are very important places that are sex-based for a reason. And there's a kind of... It's remarkable to me that politicians in this country, in Scotland and Wales and in England, seem to have given up on the, belief in reality that sex is real and that it's irrefutable and that It's really important because this isn't just about those kind of very intense places like a prison or like a rape crisis centre where it is vital that you can beg the question, why can't men budge up and let someone into solitary confinement, not women? But the point is, hang on, the point is, if politicians and a government cannot deal in reality and in truth and deal with facts that are based on the things that we all understand, then why would you have any belief in anything they say? Why would you have any belief in the justice system? Because for the kind of group that we haven't mentioned so far is women, and it's women who are being made to pay for this.
I will come out, there's lots of hands. I'll come to you, India. I know you want to come back in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, it's not trans people who are going around attacking women, either in life or in prisons. It's predatory men. The biggest offenders within prisons are actually
Well, do you think Adam Graham's a man then?
Now, I'll answer your question. This person, I'm not going to call them that because that's not the name that they go by now. We live in a civilised society, and just as
we're talking about a rapist.
Well,
I mean, I don't know how they fit into a civilised society.
I know you're desperate to drag this into the gutter, but I'm not going to go there. If there is a gay sex offender or a gay predator, we don't suddenly become homophobic. If there's a black rapist, we don't suddenly become rapists. Well, what do you mean by they're pretending they're something they're not? They could be a genuine trans person who's born that way, who's had no choice. You're making it sound like a lifestyle, something that they've opted to do. You don't know. You're presuming.
Kelly, if I just really quickly, Kelly made the point that she's very liberal-minded, and I think most of us are like that. You know, the vast majority of people, save a few bad apples, are generally of the mindset of live and let live, you know, love who you want to love, dress how you want to dress, call yourself what you want to call yourself.
Sorry.
And, you know, that's, you know, you kind of have to bend over backwards apologising as a woman and do all that whole kind of spiel before you get to say what you want to say. But generally, people are liberal-minded. What we won't accept is to be forced to say things that we know aren't true, that sex is irrefutable, and that men can turn into women by stating it after 3 months of living as a woman.
Because I must say, India, of course I will let you back in. I just want to, the First Minister herself was saying today that she thinks Ella Bryson is probably faking it. That's her view.
Yes. And
do you share that?
And it's a possibility. I'm saying I don't know. Nobody in this audience actually knows what that is. The people who do know or will make that judgment are the people that are actually talking to her, are involved in this case. But this notion, and this is the gutter that I really want to avoid, you know, this chip away at trans people generally. We started this question talking about one bad apple.
I have not chipped away at transgender people.
And it's then been expanded into the fact that trans people aren't real, they're pretending. Well,
I never said that either.
That's not the case. Trans people have existed in all cultures, around the world, all times.
Come on, India.
It's a real thing. No,
you talked about misinformation, and now you're willfully misrepresenting what I said.
You're the one trying to drag it down. We are a tiny population.
I think anyone that's seen your Twitter account, India, will know a lot about gutter
puffing
discussion.
us up into this.
Well, I tell you what we want to do, and I'm not suggesting anything but what either of you are saying, but what we want to do is have a civilised and polite conversation about it, don't we? So let's have that. Yes, the woman here.
Transgender people and gay people are not paedophiles. There are a certain percent who might be. But with this conversation, we don't put them in a male prison, we don't put them in a female prison. Is it time that we actually say, you have your own prison to go to?
No, because we're still men and women.
I agree with you, but I'm asking the question, is it not time that maybe somebody has that conversation?
OK, let me... will you forgive me? I'll just get around the audience a little bit. The woman there in the pink and yellow top.
Yeah, I'm a psychotherapist that supports a lot of children coming through this, whether it's transgender or transsexual, and it is coming into schools now. The lady asked about single-sex spaces. That is a big issue that teachers are also dealing with now, because these young people can't get access to a GP, they can't get the ball rolling in terms of really working out what they need. You know, I work through a charity, so I'm able to offer services for free. But it really is, in terms of gender reform, how is the SNP, how is the government going to support people really make sense of the reality of their identity, the supports that they need? And then in schools, where do we see a single-sex space where, you know, if we have transgender, transsexual, do we then have, you know, female, male, and then non-binary? Teachers are dealing with this on a daily basis, and they are also like the new social workers, because they're trying to support families manage this. And it's about support. Of course, it's about support. We need resources to really support these young people that need these services.
OK. A woman here in the front.
We don't allow men into female spaces. There are good men.
Start that again. I missed the beginning.
We don't allow men into female spaces. For good reason. There are good men and there are predatory men. We should not allow trans into female spaces.
So you're classing trans
there are
women
good
as
trans
men.
And there are predatory trans, and that's a fact. Women have to be safe. Women and children have to be safe.
So, for example, a transgender woman who has lived as a woman for many years, who may have had surgery, for example, to all intents, as far as anyone considers herself a woman and looks like a woman, she shouldn't be allowed in a women's own space. Is that what
How do you know? There's nothing on their head to say whether they're predatory or not.
But
the same as a man. How do you know by looking at a man if he's predatory or not?
But would you say that about a lesbian, for instance? That a predatory lesbian, and you would want to check their history? Because what you've just said there, effectively, is that trans women are men and should be treated as men.
Well, in my opinion, they still are men.
So I would go in a male jail, looking as I do, and just take my chances. And what, that would be my fault for looking like this?
Well, in my opinion, you can't change sex. That's my opinion. You can't change sex. You can live your life how you like, and I wish you no harm. But you can't biologically change sex.
You know, I'm biological, I'm a woman. I didn't choose to be trans. This is how I was born. All I've done is align my body with how I feel, so I have a reasonable life. And most trans people, as I say, there's hardly any of us around anyway. We lead normal lives. You're actually talking about 4 trans prisoners in a female estate.
Excuse me, if there's hardly any of you around, why do I have to change?
Why do what, sorry?
Why does society have to change?
Because we're a civilised society, and you do change. I could have heard this conversation in the 1970s about black people, or in the 1980s about gay people, saying, why do I have to change? Why do I have to temper my language? This type of thing. It's the same thing as being harassed.
What a cheap and outrageous allegation.
It is quite offensive considering what you have written in your Twitter about a young black woman.
What's that? Oh, can I clarify this?
You better have. I mean, what I am really hoping for, because this can be such a toxic debate, and I desperately do not want it to be on this programme. Yeah. I really don't. And I also don't want to put India in the position where she is the one person, you know, talking for all trans people. That is not the debate I want to have.
To that
but
one.
Yes.
So one thing the gender critical movement do to try and knock the credibility of trans women, trans being an adjective before woman, is to scrunch the 2 words up. So you end up with this word that doesn't even exist called trans woman, all racked up together. One particular commentator who is known for taunting trans people online did this to me, deliberately called me that, and I effectively sent a tweet, which you can all go online and look at, saying, how would you like it if I scrunched up the word black with woman to make black woman? And then I said that, you know, she was ignorant on the subject. You can go on Twitter, you can look at it. That's the answer to the question, not racist.
OK, I'm going to come to the 2 men on the panel, because you've been sitting there very quietly and haven't said anything. Good luck. And also, I just want to point out, John, I want to come to you, because this is the first time, as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, that we have, in the same room in a studio here, a representative of the UK government and the Scottish government, where after the UK government has vetoed, using this thing called Section 35, a law that has been passed by the Scottish government, by which I mean this Gender Reform Act, which would streamline, make it easier for people to change their gender. Would you like to say why the UK government has chosen to do that?
I will, but can I just address the key part of the question? And it's absolutely wrong that that man who committed 2 very serious sexual offences against women was allowed to be jailed in a female-only prison.
He was segregated.
And very serious questions have to be asked, both of the Scottish Prison Service and of the Scottish Government, as to how and why that was allowed to happen. Now, I think we all know what a woman is. We have mothers, we have sisters, we have biological women are biological women, trans women are trans women, and of course we have a legal process. We have a legal process to allow people to change their gender. That's something that I personally support and the UK government supports, and we need to support people and recognise the very challenging circumstances that people going through that process have to face. But we need to ensure that people going through that process have the necessary safeguards, society has necessary safeguards in place to ensure that we don't have the scenario we had in that female prison, where you had somebody purporting to be a female was allowed to change their sex to allow them to put themselves in a female-only prison. Population. Which gets me back, Fiona, to your question about the concerns we had about the bill going through the Scottish Parliament. We did not think there was the suitable and necessary safeguards in place to give protection to women and others in society to stop that type of scenario arising. Section 35, the Secretary of State for Scotland used Section 35 because we did have very serious concerns about the implications of this bill in a number of areas, whether it's women-only spaces under the part of the Impact on the Equalities Act. But this is the first time since 1999, over 340 bills have been passed by the Scottish Parliament, and this is the first time that this has happened. Given the seriousness of this nature, given the strong advice the UK government and the Secretary of State was receiving, I absolutely believe it was the right decision. The Scottish Government rushed this through despite serious concerns that were being raised across society, not just by politicians but by others. And this is why we believe the Scottish Government need to go away and come forward with another bill.
India, I'll come back to you. I'll just get the rest of the panel in. Ian, do you support that decision?
Well, I walked past Donald Dure's statue in Glasgow earlier on, coming here, and Donald Dure created Section 35 to facilitate the Scottish Parliament to be able to pass laws in devolved areas that had cross-border implications. The key thing about Section 35 is you're supposed to resolve all these problems before you get there. It's supposed to be a last resort. Both governments have failed to resolve those issues, so we're now in this debate about who gets trades off in terms of rights and the concerns that are coming across in terms of cross-border issues. So
which position do you take? Do you take the Scottish Labour position, which is to support the Act introduced in Scotland, or do you take the English Labour and the UK-wide, I suppose, but the English Labour position, the position of Keir Starmer, which is not to support it?
No, we support the modernisation of the GRA. It's our GRA Act from 2004. And the Scottish Labour Party were right to back it in Scotland. They got the Equality Act, which is something we've been discussing on the face of the bill. What is inconceivable, though, is that we had an amendment down, I think it was a Conservative amendment, which we backed, to stop convicted sex offenders from being put into prisons, and people who have been accused of sexual offences put into prisons, and the Scottish Government voted that down. I'm not sure why, because all of this debate, the one thing that the Bryson case has shown is that the concerns that people were raising, whether they're legitimate or not, and that will now be tested in the courts, have now been heightened because the Bryson case has said, actually, this is what we were screaming about. And this is the concerns that we had. And the bottom line we've got here is rapists should not be in women's prisons, full stop, regardless of who they are.
Let me get a bit more around the audience. Right, so many of you with your hands up, I'm wondering where to start. Yes, the man there in the burgundy jacket with the black polo neck.
Ella Bryson can call herself a trans woman, and that's good. I think that's right and proper. I think what needs to happen is the public need to have faith in Scottish Prison Service and the clinical colleagues that make a risk assessment of all prisoners and how they're housed. Now, I think the media have got it wrong, as you said, India, and there was never any women in Cotton Vale at risk because the person was segregated. Moving forward, I think we just have to put faith in what our clinical colleagues in the prison service are doing. So,
okay. The young woman in the grey top.
Hi, yes, I completely agree with what you just said. I am in agreement with the bill, and quite frankly, I think this whole conversation is distracting from more important things like the economic crisis at the moment, the transport crisis, the education crisis, and I don't really think, you know, a predator is a predator at the end of the day, and I think trans people are at the end of the day, you know, they are abused so much. And I think it's just, frankly, it's shocking that this is a conversation that keeps on going on, and there's other things to talk about.
And the man next to you, you were nodding in agreement.
Hello. LGBT people have been attacked since forever using the examples of bad apples. You can go all the way back to Section 28. You can go all the way back to 1967 and the legalisation of same-sex relations. And I think the exact same is happening now, and I think it's frankly really bad and bigoted.
Okay. Jenny, before I move on, I just want to come in. Would you like to respond to John in terms of the use of this unprecedented use disorder, Section 35?
I think a few points. I think India made the point that this is not to do with the GRR. We need to be very careful.
So for those who are not aware, the Gender Recognition Reform, which then led to the Gender Reform Act, which, for those south of border might not be so familiar with, which is this streamlining of being able to change your gender.
Indeed. So there's been a policy in place in the Scottish Prison Service since, I think, 2014 in relation to trans prisoners. So this is not a new policy, and obviously we spoke about the review earlier on. I think it is important to recognise this is one of the most consulted on pieces of legislation in the Scottish Parliament's history. 6 years of consultation. This was not a rush-through piece of legislation. The Conservatives used to back it. And what has happened in the interim years is that it's undoubtedly now being used to weaponise a culture war. And I think we've heard some of that play out, unfortunately, this evening. But I do want to talk to some of the politics in relation to Section 35, because I know that the Social Justice Secretary, Fiona Robinson, had a call with Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, only last week to get a better understanding of some of the UK government's concerns. It is worth saying that the UK government at no point raised any of these concerns throughout the passage of the bill, despite having ample opportunity to do so. And I think Kemi Badenoch even met with Fiona Robinson just in December. At no point were any concerns raised, we would have listened to them, of course, and we would have acted in good faith. But essentially the message from Alistair Jack, the Secretary of State for Scotland, was change the bill, drop it, or we'll see you in court. Now, I don't think that's an acceptable way for the Secretary of State to behave. But obviously, we want to try to work with the UK Government to get a resolution here. So we've asked for more detail on what that looks like. And we have had no answer. So, John, perhaps you can tell us today what the key challenges are. And will Alistair Jack meet with Fiona Bruce again on this very matter so we can get a resolution?
The Secretary of State was very clear, both in the House of Commons when he made his statement explaining why he was using this power, and in the 13-page statement.
How would he like it to change in order for the UK Government to feel it could approve it?
It's the Scottish Government. We've set out the concerns that we have. I mean, the example that was used earlier about prisons. I mean, the other real concern we have is, for example, women's refuges. I mean, what would happen if somebody decided to change their gender to allow them to have access to
I mean, it's worth pointing out
that's the type of example. That's an example. That's an example as to why the safeguards.
Hang on. Hang on. You're both talking at the same time. I was just going to point out that a number of organisations supporting refugees in Scotland have supported the Gender Reform Act.
But there's not a consistent view. There's big concerns being raised in Scotland about the impact that this Act is going to have.
And in terms of particular changes, there's nothing you're going to suggest here.
It's the Scottish Government's bill. The Scottish Government's bill.
Very quickly, because you made an excellent point over there. There's a lot of other important things going on that we should be talking about, and I want to get to them. So very quickly,
to that point, the reason why this is so important and the reason why it has to be discussed is because I am the only person on this panel who is of the mind, like the vast majority of the rest of the country, that sex is not something that you can change. The SNP, the Conservatives are, you know, in large part the orchestrators of this issue by introducing under Theresa May changes to the idea of self-ID and raising the question itself. Okay. And the reason why it's so important that your political class does not reflect the common sense of the nation is because this isn't just about this. You're right. This isn't just about predatory men or predatory trans people or prisons or rape crisis centres. This is about understanding what's true and false in society. It's about how we raise our children, how we socialise our kids, how we get them to understand the world, how we get them to understand each other. It's actually about, you know, for me, the thing that I find most remarkable is that we would engage in such legal disingenuousness as to suggest that you could change the idea that a man rapes a woman and later say, no, it was a woman who raped a woman, or that a woman was born on January the 21st and then 20 years later say, no, actually, that was a man. And the reason why it's important to stand by the idea of fact being able to, something that you can hold in your hands in society, is because if we let go of that, not only is it bad for women, and not only is it bad for collecting data, but it's also bad for trust in politics, because the lot of these lot are feeding you a whole load of nonsense.
OK. I've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to let you go on very quickly, India.
Yeah, really quick. I mean, this is essentially what you would hear in 1970s about gay couples, and that it was totally unnatural for a man to be with another man or a woman to be with another woman. It's the same conversation rehashed and dressed up in a completely different way.
Strong feelings, not surprisingly. But also, strong feelings about this next question, which I've only got 10 minutes left to cover now. You made the very good point that a lot of people are worrying about how they're going to pay their bills and pressing issues right up against them every day in their homes, in their jobs, in their daily lives. Chris Jones, you've got a question related to that.
The International Monetary Fund is forecasting the UK economy will fare worse than any other economy in the developed world in 2023. What is the solution?
What is the solution? Because that is what the IMF is saying. Obviously, the forecasts are made. They're not always correct, as it then turns out to be, but that is what the IMF is saying. At the moment, the UK economy will fare worse than any other economy in the developed world, including Russia's. John, what's the solution?
Well, all major economies are facing very serious challenges.
Yes, but ours is forecast to be the worst.
Largely around...
so why is it worse for us?
Inflation. Well, the IMF have made predictions about the UK economy in the past, under Labour governments, under Conservative governments.
So do you think it's not true?
They very often underestimate the performance of the UK economy. I believe our economy is fundamentally sound. The large pressure that we are facing undoubtedly is the rising cost of living, the rate of inflation. Of course, we all know.
So what's the solution? That's the question. Because I've spent so long, I've got 9 minutes left to get through it. What do you think the solution is?
The illegal war in Ukraine is driving up gas and energy prices. We need to ensure that the forces of Putin are pushed back, which is why supporting the Ukrainian government in that effort is so important. The Bank of England is also taking action to address the rate of inflation, which I believe will ensure, again, the core of the economy is sound, because by cutting inflation, that's the best tax cut you can provide to households across the United Kingdom. And on top of that, the UK government has put in place a whole range of measures to support people with the rising cost of energy and the rising cost of living generally. But by taking these measures, of ensuring we protect the sound nature of our economy and ensuring that we protect the growth that we have...
the IMF obviously doesn't think it is sound at the moment. But
well, as I said, the IMF have not always been accurate with projections.
No, and that is a fair point. Ian?
Well, what John forgot to mention was the fact that his colleagues crashed the economy 6 months ago, and everyone here is paying for it. And there was a statistic that came out the other day that showed that during the previous Labour government, the UK managed to get 8% of all global inward investment, and last year it was 1.2%. We've gone through 12 years of stagnation in wages. We've gone through 12 years of pretty much no growth in this country. And until the government can find a way of developing that growth and getting growth, we will never get out of this problem that we've got. We've got the highest inflation in 40 years, the biggest fall in living standards since the 50s when records began. We've got the highest tax burden on working people in 80 years. The solution is you have to grow the economy, and you've got to do that through trade. You've got to do that through spreading economic development throughout the whole country. You've got to do that by dealing with the climate crisis and getting good, high-quality jobs in this country. The UK and Scottish governments are brilliant at creating green jobs, but none of them are here. They're all abroad as the offshore stuff. So it's a huge problem for this government, and they just can't talk their way out of it. And if I just make one other point, Shell today made eye-watering profits driven by the energy crisis, paid for by everybody's bills in this room, and the government refuses to put a proper windfall tax that could help everybody through the winter.
Well, the solution is very simple. You don't need a PhD in economics, which I certainly don't have, to know that the issue with this country's economy is a lack of productivity. It goes beyond and before the pandemic. It goes beyond and before the war in Ukraine. And politicians are very fond of kind of pointing that way when they're asked who's to blame or what the solution is to fix the economy. And, you know, there are so many things that could...
for 13 years.
There are so many things... Yeah, and there's... the Conservatives have, you know, in someone like Liz Truss, made the sounds that you might find sort of acceptable in terms of using the word growth, but there's absolutely nothing substantial in the basis of that kind of promise. The Conservative Party at the moment is just obsessed with tax, you know, not paying it, maybe paying a little bit more, all the kind of rest of it. But there's no discussion about investment, about, you know, and the Labour Party's at fault here, because I was listening to Ed Miliband, I think it was, on the radio this morning, talking about the fact that, you know, the solution to the energy crisis is to, you know, not invest in any kind of new exploration in North Sea oil, when, you know, anyone can tell you that wind turbines and solar panels and all the rest of it are not going to keep us warm and not going to keep, you know, our taps running throughout this winter. So there's a lack of ambition in all political parties, but particularly the Conservatives at the moment. There's a lack of kind of foresight, and there's no sense of being able to, you know, at the start of this programme, we talked about where is the money going to come from? How can striking workers ask for money, and where's it going to come from? Well, it could come very easily from a country and a government that was dedicated to generating wealth, to improving the living conditions of its citizens, but we've given that all up.
Ella,
because,
forgive me, I'm sorry, but I need to bring the rest of the panel. India.
Yeah, I'd just like to go back to what John said. I think he said protect the growth, and I'm wondering what growth, because I can't see any anywhere. I think the answer to the question is very obvious. It's tax the rich, which used to be seen as a bit of a cliche, but I think there's a lot of merit in it. When you look at the...
So what do you mean specific? Do you mean raise the highest level of income tax? Do you mean a mansion tax? Do you mean a...
How do you define rich?
Yeah, I define rich as if you look at the massive concerns such as Amazon and Google and the energy companies that are here now, that we need a proper windfall tax, not one that has a time limit on.
Shell's paying 75%. Shell's paying 75% of those profits they made today. 75% as a consequence of this government's windfall tax.
As well as I do, that isn't just on all the money that comes in. There are conditions and there are ways to move money around so that doesn't actually apply. For instance, the fuel that's sold at the forecourt, that's not subject to the windfall tax there. And I think if you look at Scotland, the money that it had, or it should have had, going all the way back to the 1980s when Maggie Thatcher sold off the reserves in the North Sea, you know, you should really have the same as Norway. You should have a sovereign wealth fund for times such as this when it's hard to see you through. So, yeah, I think the rich should be picking up the burden.
Jenny.
I thought it was interesting that Ian didn't mention Brexit, of course, because 78% of your constituency had voted to stay in the European Union, and yet we are out. Scotland is out against our will, of course. The majority of Scots supported staying in the European Union, and a poll last year actually suggested it was now much higher.
You voted for no deal.
But in the reality that we face right now, the food prices are going through the roof, so food prices now more than £200 more expensive than they were 2 years ago. Scotland's lost out on £300 million in structural funds, and the Scottish Government is having to spend £1.4 billion to mitigate against Conservative policies like the bedroom tax. We can do so much better than this, so the answer, Fiona, is independence for Scotland in Europe.
Now, how could I guess you were going to say that? Hang on, let me get from the audience in.
Brexit's so bad, you want to do it all again?
Otherwise, I'm never going to hear from the audience. Yes, the man there. Hang on, guys, let's hear from the audience. Well,
with bells.
That's why the people here, because they want to say something. So, yes, the man there in the blue jacket.
Yep.
Briefly, if you would, because I haven't got long.
I think perhaps you should ask why successive governments for the last 40, 50 years allowed us to become totally dependent on Russian gas and oil and didn't have a long-term plan for our own energy use.
OK. The man here in the front of the check shirt.
Don't you think the Shell thing, 52 billion, is atrocious? They're filling this money in, and I mean, it's huge profits. Well, there's people out there starving. There's people working going to food banks. And you can't get hold of a doctor and a nurse. I've had Parkinson's for 15 years, and trying to get a doctor or a nurse is impossible. I mean, I just moved house 3 years ago, and I've not seen a doctor 3 years, and it's just atrocious. This country's coming to this. You know, it's all money, you know, and it's all the rich people is getting it.
OK. Let me just... I've got 30 seconds here. The man there in the pink shirt with the glasses.
So, you know, last year, Shell paid out £5 billion to their shareholders. That's more money than they actually invested in renewable energy. Why are we allowing these huge multinational companies to, you know, pay so much money to their shareholders and not invest it back into, you know, people in the UK? It's just really wrong.
OK. Very little bit of time left. The woman there in the black top.
Yeah, I noticed the comment about the SNP and the independence, and we would all be much better, but given the conversations that we've had tonight about strikes, we've heard all the challenges that we've got in the economy, the NHS, health, education, it would be nice if the SNP government could focus on that rather than the legal costs for IndyRef 2.
All right, I'm afraid our time is up. That's it, our hour is over. Thank you very much to everyone here on the panel. Thank you to all of you putting your points across, very much appreciated. And of course, thank you to you at home for watching as well from Question Time in Glasgow. Bye-bye.